Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now before I begin, tell me, where are you watching from? I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that stayed with me for years. It began on a gray afternoon in early spring, the kind where the air smells faintly of rain and old earth. I remember because I was sitting by my kitchen window, watching the drizzle slide down the glass, when I found the letter again. It was tucked in the same drawer where I keep old receipts, spare batteries, and mismatched keys. Ordinary things that somehow gather the weight of time. The envelope was creased at the corners, the ink slightly faded, but the handwriting, his handwriting, was still unmistakable. The letter my friend's son wrote still rests in that drawer, untouched for years, though I've read it more times than I'd ever admit. His name was Daniel. He was 22 when he wrote it, and I was 47, his mother's closest friend since college. I can still see him in my mind, tall with a quiet sort of charm, the kind that sneaks up on you. I'd watched him grow from a boy who loved climbing trees in their backyard into a young man who spoke with thoughtfulness beyond his age. That summer, Daniel had come home after finishing college. His mother, my dear friend Elaine, was overjoyed, and we often spent evenings at her house, sharing meals, laughter, and stories from the past. But something was different about Daniel that year. There was a calm maturity about him, a deeper way he listened when people spoke. Sometimes, when we all sat on the porch watching the sunset, I'd catch him glancing at me, not in the careless way young men sometimes look, but in a searching, almost questioning way. At first, I brushed it off as imagination. After all, I was just his mother's friend, the woman who brought homemade pies and helped plant flowers in their front yard. But as the summer stretched on, our conversations grew longer, quieter. We'd talk about books, about loss, about the odd loneliness that can come with getting older, even when surrounded by people. He listened like he really wanted to understand, and there was comfort in that, unexpected but gentle. One afternoon, Elaine had to leave town for a few days to visit her sister. She asked me to check in on Daniel while she was gone, make sure he didn't forget to eat between his job interviews and late-night studying. I agreed, thinking nothing of it. That Friday, I'd brought over a casserole and a bottle of iced tea. The house felt strangely still without Elaine's usual hum of movement. Daniel was sitting at the dining table, surrounded by papers and notes, his brow furrowed in thought. When he looked up and smiled, it was the kind of smile that could warm a cold room. We ate in the quiet rhythm of easy company, the kind that doesn't need constant words. I remember the soft ticking of the clock, the sound of rain starting again outside. After dinner, he helped me wash the dishes, and as he handed me a damp plate, he said something that stayed with me. "You always make this place feel like home," he said softly, "even when Mom's not here." I didn't know what to say. There was something in his tone, respectful but tender, that stirred a feeling I couldn't name. I changed the subject quickly, asked about his plans after graduation. He spoke about uncertainty, about wanting to find meaning, about feeling caught between youth and adulthood. When I left that night, he walked me to my car. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy with its scent. He stood by the gate, hands in his pockets, and said, "Thank you for always being there, for Mom, and for me." I smiled and told him to get some rest. But as I drove away, my heart felt strangely full and uncertain all at once. A few weeks later, Elaine gave me an envelope. She said Daniel had left it for me before moving to another city for work. I thought it was a thank you card, maybe a note of farewell. But when I opened it, the first line stopped me cold. He had written, "You've changed the way I see people, the way I see care, and what it means to feel understood." There was nothing inappropriate, nothing that crossed any boundary, but there was a depth of emotion there that caught me off guard. He spoke of how our talks had helped him understand himself, how my kindness had taught him a quiet strength he hadn't found elsewhere. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my drawer. I didn't know what to make of it then, only that it stirred something gentle but lasting in me, a reminder that connection, in its purest form, can appear when we least expect it. And sometimes a letter can hold a moment you never quite stop returning to. That was years ago, yet every so often, when the rain begins to fall and the house feels a little too quiet, I find myself opening that drawer again. Time has a way of blurring the edges of memory, doesn't it? After Daniel's letter, life went on much as before, at least on the surface. Elaine talked often about his new job in Chicago, about how proud she was of him settling into adulthood. I listened, smiled, and nodded in all the right places, but every mention of his name stirred a quiet ache, something unspoken, like a melody you can't quite hum but still remember by heart. For nearly 2 years that letter stayed in my drawer. I never replied, though I thought about it many times. What could I have written? Thank you for your honesty? Your words meant more than you know. It all felt too simple for what it truly was, a piece of his heart laid gently before me, so I let the silence hold it instead. Then one late autumn evening, Elaine called unexpectedly. I still remember the sharp chill in the air, the scent of burning leaves drifting through my window. "Guess who's coming home for a visit?" she said, her voice bubbling with excitement. My heart stumbled a little. "Daniel." She said he'd taken a short break from work, needed time to breathe, as she put it. He'd be staying for a few weeks. When I saw him again, it was at Elaine's annual Thanksgiving dinner. The house was alive with chatter, the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon filling the air. Daniel was taller, leaner, his hair a little shorter, but that same warmth in his eyes hadn't changed. He greeted me with an easy smile, though there was a flicker of recognition there, something only the two of us could sense. "Mrs. Turner," he said teasingly, still using the title he knew I disliked. "It's Margaret," I corrected, laughing. "You're far too old to call me that now." He grinned, and for a moment it felt like no time had passed at all. We spent the evening among familiar faces, catching up on stories, laughter spilling through the room like music. Yet beneath it all, I could feel that quiet undercurrent between us, the awareness of the letter, unspoken but not forgotten. Later that night, after most guests had gone home, Elaine insisted I stay for a cup of tea. Daniel offered to make it. We ended up in the kitchen again, the same one where we'd shared dinner years ago. The sounds of the house had softened to a gentle hush, the hum of the refrigerator the only thing breaking the silence. He handed me a steaming mug, his hand brushing mine, just briefly. There was a pause before he spoke. "I wasn't sure if you'd ever read it," he said quietly, eyes fixed on the floor. "I did," I replied, "more than once." He nodded slowly. I was afraid it might have been too much. I took a deep breath. "No, Daniel." It was honest, and I respected that. There was something deeply human in the moment. No pretense, no misunderstanding, just two people acknowledging a shared truth. I could see the years had changed him. He wasn't the uncertain young man I'd known before. There was steadiness now, a sense of self. We talked long into the night about his work, his loneliness in the city, the feeling of chasing success, but missing connection. I told him about my own quiet days, about finding small joys in routine, about how strange it was to feel both fulfilled and restless at the same time. Before I left, he said something I've never forgotten. "You know, sometimes I think people come into our lives not to stay, but to remind us of who we really are." I looked at him then, really looked, and saw not the boy I'd once known, but the man he'd become. There was no awkwardness, no confusion, only a deep gratitude that life had allowed our paths to cross in such a meaningful way. As I drove home that night, the roads were slick with frost. Streetlights shimmered on the pavement like scattered stars. I thought about the letter waiting in my drawer, and for the first time, I didn't feel the ache of uncertainty. Instead, I felt peace. It wasn't about the words written on paper anymore. It was about the connection that had shaped us both, quietly, respectfully, and without expectation. That night, as the snow began to fall softly outside my window, I realized something simple but profound. Sometimes the most lasting relationships are not defined by permanence, but by the kindness and honesty we leave behind in one another's hearts. Winter came that year with an unusual quiet. Snow blanketed the streets in soft white layers, and everything seemed to move slower, as if the world itself was catching its breath. I didn't hear from Daniel for a while after Thanksgiving. Life slipped back into its usual rhythm: work, errands, small gatherings with friends, but every now and then, my thoughts wandered back to that conversation in Elaine's kitchen. There had been something final in it, though neither of us said goodbye. It was in late February when his name appeared on my phone again. Just a short message. "Are you free for coffee tomorrow?" I hesitated before replying, not because I didn't want to see him, but because I wasn't sure what seeing him again would stir up. Still, I said yes. We met at a small cafe near the river, one of those old-fashioned places where the chairs creak and the windows fog up with steam from the espresso machine. The snow outside had begun to melt, trickling down the gutters in slow, steady streams. He was already there when I arrived, sitting by the window, nursing a cup of coffee and looking out at the water. When he saw me, his face lit up, not in the eager way of youth, but in a calm, familiar way that made me feel instantly at ease. "You haven't changed at all," he said, standing to pull out a chair for me. "Oh, I've changed plenty," I replied with a laugh. "I just hide it well." We talked easily, the way people do when they've moved past the uncertainty of what to say. He told me about his new job, how he'd switched companies, how the city still felt too fast at times. He spoke about missing home, missing the slower pace, the simpler moments. At one point, he grew quiet, his gaze drifting to the window again. "Do you ever think about how some people come into your life and leave a mark you can't quite explain?" he asked softly. I nodded. "All the time." He smiled then, but it was a wistful smile. "I think you were that for me. You helped me understand what care really looks like, how it's not about saying the right things, but about being there when someone needs grounding." His words caught me off guard. There was no romantic tone, no implication, just sincerity, deep and unadorned. I realized in that moment how much he'd grown. The young man who once wrote from a place of searching had become someone who understood what he'd been searching for all along: meaning, not approval. We stayed there for hours, the afternoon light turning golden, then dimming into evening. As we left the café, he insisted on walking me to my car. The air was crisp, the river glinting faintly under the last of the daylight. He paused before I opened the door and said quietly, "You know, I think some letters aren't meant to be answered. They're just meant to be read and remembered." I felt something shift inside me then, a release maybe. I nodded, smiling. And sometimes that's enough. We said goodbye with an embrace, one filled with warmth and mutual understanding. It wasn't the kind of moment that begged for more. It was complete as it was. After that day, we stayed in touch sporadically. A few messages, an occasional call. Life took him forward. He was promoted, moved again, started seeing someone new. I heard about it through Elaine, who was delighted that he finally found someone. I felt only happiness for him, no trace of the confusion I might have once carried. That spring, I decided to redecorate my home office. While clearing out drawers and old papers, I came across the letter again. The envelope had yellowed slightly with age. I opened it, not with the ache of old feelings, but with quiet gratitude. As I read his words again, the same words that once unsettled me, I noticed something I hadn't before. It wasn't a letter about longing. It was a letter about growth, about seeing another person's kindness as a mirror to one's own capacity to care. I folded it carefully and placed it back in the drawer, this time not out of hesitation, but as a keepsake of something meaningful that had come and gone with grace. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks, I poured myself a cup of tea and thought about the many people who come and go through our lives. Some leave pain, some leave joy, and a few, just a few, leave understanding. Danielle had been one of those few. And as I sat there in the quiet of my little home, I realized that sometimes the truest kind of love isn't about holding on. It's about learning when to let a moment simply exist, perfectly untouched, in memory. It's been several years since that last meeting with Danielle. Life, as it always does, moved forward quietly, gently, without fanfare. Seasons turned, friends grew older, and my world settled into a rhythm of small, steady joys, mornings in the garden, phone calls with Elaine, afternoons spent reading by the window where the light still catches the same way it always has. Elaine and I remained close. We talked often about her grandchildren, her travels, her son. Sometimes she would share little updates about Daniel, his wedding, his new home, his growing family. Each time I listened with a smile, genuinely happy for him. There was never any sting, no trace of what if. Just a sense of quiet gratitude that I had been a small, steady chapter in his early story. One spring morning, I received a letter in the mail. The handwriting on the envelope stopped me cold. It was Daniel's. For a moment, I just held it, feeling the paper between my fingers, as though the years had folded in on themselves. I took a deep breath and opened it carefully. His words were familiar, calm and thoughtful, like the man I remembered. He wrote about how life had taken on a new kind of depth now that he was a father. How he'd found himself thinking about the people who had shaped him. His mother, his teachers, and, to my surprise, me. He said that when he looked at his son, he hoped to offer him the same steadiness and compassion he once felt for me when he was young and uncertain. He ended the letter with a line that caught in my throat. I've come to understand that kindness leaves echoes that don't fade. Yours has stayed with me through every stage of my life. I sat with the letter in my lap for a long time, sunlight spilling across the table. It wasn't sadness I felt. It was something richer, deeper. The awareness that connection, in its purest form, outlives time. It changes shape, but never disappears. That evening, I walked to the park near my house. The cherry trees were just beginning to bloom, soft pink petals trembling in the breeze. Families strolled by, laughter echoing faintly across the path. I found a bench overlooking the pond and sat there, thinking of how our lives touch others in ways we may never fully understand. It struck me then that the letter I kept in my drawer all those years ago and this new one in my hands were like bookends, one written from a place of searching, the other from a place of peace. And somewhere between them was the story of two people whose lives crossed just long enough to remind each other of what truly matters. When I returned home, I took both letters from the drawer and read them side by side. The first spoke of learning and awakening, the second of gratitude and reflection. Together, they told a complete story, one that had never needed more than honesty and kindness to exist. I placed them back carefully, tied with a small ribbon, not to hide them away but to honor what they had become. A gentle reminder that the human heart is shaped not only by great love stories or dramatic moments, but by quiet connections that teach us to see ourselves and others more clearly. Sometimes, when the evenings grow long and I hear the soft hum of rain outside, I'd open that drawer and run my fingers over the envelopes. Not out of longing, but in reverence for the way certain people pass through our lives like soft footprints in snow, never forgotten, just quietly absorbed into who we become. If there's one thing Daniel's letters taught me, it's this. We don't always need to be the main character in someone's life to leave an imprint. Sometimes, just being there, listening, and offering understanding is enough to change the course of a person's story. And in turn, they change ours. So tonight, as I sit by that same window with a cup of tea, watching the rain trace its familiar paths down the glass, I find comfort in knowing that the letter my friend's son wrote still rests in my drawer, not as a relic of the past, but as a quiet promise that the most unexpected connections can echo for a lifetime.